Good evening. Welcome, everyone. How wonderful it is for us to gather for this conversation about how our faith informs our voting, and not just for people, but for propositions. This evening, I'd like to begin with our land acknowledgement. So I do welcome you again from the Bay Vista room and our Fireside. And we are very much part of the charism of the Sisters of the Holy Names of Jesus and Mary. And in keeping with their mission and charism, we acknowledge that Holy Names University sits on the traditional grounds and lands of the Mawakma Ohlone people. The Ohlone people continue to have a presence today in Oakland and in the Bay Area. We respect our elders, both past and present. And now I turn it over to Jenny.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. So today I'm very excited to introduce everyone to the process of tonight's conversation. We're going to start with opening statements, kind of opening sharings from each of our panelists. And they will share with us the answer to the foundational question we've asked them, which is, how is your faith informing your decision making or discernment as you prepare to vote in the upcoming election? How has your faith been a part of your own process of voting or civic engagement? And every one of our panelists will share on their own for a few minutes. I will introduce them as they come to the podium, so to speak. After each of the panelists have shared, Father Sal is participating as both co-director of campus ministry, but also as a listener and reflector. So after the panelists will talk, Father Sal will reflect kind of what he's heard, and then maybe ask follow-up questions to clarify anything. After that, we'll open it to the panelists to talk with each other or ask any questions for follow-up among themselves, as we want this to be a dialogue. But then shortly thereafter, we're opening the floor for anyone here to ask questions of our panelists as well. And so we do invite you to participate by putting your questions in the chat, either to everybody or to campus ministry if you prefer to be more private and anonymous. And then when we get to the question and answer time, you could also raise your hand, which there's a button for that, and we can call on you to say your question live. We'll be recording tonight's conversation up until the Q&A, until that time, so that we can have a safe and honest conversation towards the end. We want to keep that confidential in this space, but the opening statements will be public for all to see. And so now I'm very pleased to introduce Sister Marcia Friediger, born in San Francisco and the eldest of 8 children. Sister Marcia was educated by the Holy Name Sisters at St. Anselm's Elementary, which I believe, is that in Marin? Yeah, in Marin, right? And Marin Catholic High School. After entering the Holy Name Sisters, Sister Marcia taught elementary school for 3 years, and at Holy Names High School, she taught there for 7. She's taught she's a staple around campus when we're there. She's taught a variety of different courses at HNU, different times for a total of 22 years. She also went out and lived and studied in Pennsylvania. Sister Marcia got a BA at HNU, a master's from Brigham Young University, which is very unique and interesting, a PhD at UC Irvine. And I'm really pleased that she's here today to talk with us. So Sister Marcia, it's all yours.
Thank you, Jenny. And it's nice to look at the list of names. I'm looking at people whose names I know and people who could share in depth on this topic. So it's a little bit daunting to look at the breadth of knowledge and engagement of people who are joining us today. When I thought about it, it was an interesting question to think about, because I'm not sure I've kind of put how do I vote, or at least talked about how it fits with my Catholic faith. And as I thought about it, there seemed to be three things that I'd like to emphasize. The first, I know it's very influenced by Catholic social teaching, which builds on the teachings of Jesus. And I know for me, it's always been important that if God is our Father, or if we use the mother imagery, then everybody in the world are our brothers and sisters, and we can't just ignore them. And so I think that's kind of a basic root of a lot of things that are important to me. Secondly, I look at the common good and ask myself, what's good for all humanity and for our common home, the earth, which we all share? And then the third is discernment, a word we use a lot in Catholic circles, trying to make good choices from what we know. And in voting, it's a challenge to try to figure out how do we know what we know, and where can we get good information that can influence that. Pope Francis has stated that an authentic faith always involves a deep desire to change the world, to leave this world somehow better than we found it. So to go back to my first point, what are some of the things that fall under Catholic social teaching? Many things, but some of the ones that struck me the most are the needs of the most vulnerable. Who are those who are ill? Who are those who are living in poverty? Second, the dignity of work. Being paid a just wage and having work conditions that promote safety and well-being for all is important. And since I taught things like business ethics at Holy Names University, that one's really important to me. Care of God's creation. What kind of a world are we leaving for future generations that is livable and sustainable? And do we have a responsibility beyond our own generation? And then, of course, concern for life and the dignity of each person, thus care for the stranger, the immigrant, those to be born, those marginalized by racism or other isms. And then a need for families, communities, and societies to be able to flourish in a way that supports life. All of these and many more fit under the Catholic social teaching category. When I think about common good in this election, it's a huge challenge. And this pushed me to do more reading of more of the theologians and people speaking on this. And someone has said, there probably hasn't been a candidate in about 30 years that lines up totally with the Catholic social teachings or any party. You find some one place, some the other. And so we have to figure out, what do we do with that? And what is it that we need to look at people and look at propositions that seem to create a better society for all? How do we try to weigh those goods? Then, of course, you've got the California propositions, and I voted in California all my life. And sometimes they are so confusing, as we know. Sometimes you think you want X, and you think you need to vote yes to get X, but if you read it carefully, no, you need to vote no to get X. Anyway, we know that that's a huge challenge. So trying to figure out who's supporting each side, trying to look at the different sources of where the funding is coming for the proposals. And we also know that so often, even if they're good things, they end up in the courts. So I get a little discouraged by the propositions in California. Who would be helped and who would be hurt by it? If we're talking about raising money, what's the track record of the groups asking for that, and where has it gone? As an aside, I know Sister Rosemary, who lives with me, has been working with some League of Women Voters group that's looking at how is the money that's supposed to go to housing in the city of Oakland been used, and really getting into the weeds and tracking that, which is very difficult for most of us as voters to do. And then discernment. Sometimes that's choosing between two goods. sometimes that's trying to figure out what are the implications if you go one way or another. And I know particularly on the proposals, that's really a challenge. I like to look at a bunch of different sources. A League of Women Voters usually is helpful. The Friends, the Quakers usually put out something with their suggestions. A Network Lobby, which is a national group of Catholic sisters who keep a close eye on politics. Reading news sources. I find the ads on TV are pretty much better to be ignored because they all come across almost as propaganda rather than really useful. And I love the propositions. They give you a number and they don't remind you which of the 12 things is the content of it. There's so many issues in our world that need addressing. COVID, healthcare, homelessness, racism, climate crisis, foreign affairs, human trafficking, migration due to war, hunger, and impossible political situations. So I think the thing is, how do we nudge things along for the good? Another quote from St. Francis is, he says, a good Catholic meddles in politics. I love that because it's not like we can just ignore it. And I think in the last several years, Catholics have probably become even more engaged in the political process. When I think of my voting life, and I've voted in every election that I possibly could, and even if I've been on the end of it, I think it's important to try to look from a faith perspective. Somebody said, do they take Jesus into the ballot box with them? I don't think so for me, but because I think that may or may not work. But I think trying to sort things out, trying to figure out what seems to be the best for the most is something that I try to do. So it's one way of thinking about things.
Thank you, Sister Marcia. Now I'd like to introduce our second panelist, Chris Trinidad, who is humbled and honored to be part of the founding leadership team of Cristo Rey de La Salle East Bay High School, which is right down the hill from us in Holy Names down in Fruitvale. Chris is from the north, from Vancouver, British Columbia, where he was born and raised. And he came down to San Francisco about 10 years ago and has since then worked primarily in Catholic education as an educator and partner in mission with a variety of different schools in the East Bay, De La Salle High School, and now Cristo Rey, St. Mary's College Prep in Berkeley. He also was part of our team in campus ministry at Holy Names for 7 or 8 years, I think, as our music minister. Chris is an incredible professional musician and singer. He has degrees in jazz studies, music education, theology and liturgical studies, and educational leadership at SCU. And so I'm really grateful for him to be here today to talk a little bit about his perspective and his discernment. Chris.
Well, thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Sal and Evelyn. It's nice to see the sisters on the call today, and all the familiar faces and the faces of people I'm meeting for the first time. Thank you for inviting me. I am humbled to be a part of this. As Jenny mentioned, I grew up in Vancouver, British Columbia, and I wanted to kind of frame my thoughts today by starting with a little bit of a story just to kind of get things going. But before I kind of frame that story, I thought about what you said, Sister Marcia, just about how Catholic social teaching affects the ways in which I too kind of see, live and move and have my being here in the United States. And my first encounter and understanding of Catholic social teaching really only arose about 10 years ago. I would say I'm a lifelong Catholic, a cradle Catholic. So Catholic social teaching, I want to add a couple of other C's in there. As Jenny mentioned earlier, I'm Canadian, so that context is important. I'll talk a little bit about community and the role of an informed conscience. And the other things that I want to add in there to help frame the conversation as well are some of the experiences, encounters that I've had, and kind of bring that under the larger umbrella of ecclesia. So 4 C's and 3 E's. So, but first, just a little story. So I'm a first generation Filipino Canadian, again, born and raised in Vancouver, British Columbia. Important to mention BC because I don't know if you're familiar with geography. It does lay on the left coast, so to speak, just north of Seattle. For those of you that haven't been there, characterized geographically by really beautiful, pristine mountains and land and sea and water and cleanliness and fresh air and single payer healthcare and social safety nets and all of the things that I had been privileged to grow up with. So that was my context kind of growing up, Filipino by heritage. And since we're in the midst of Filipino American History Month, it's sort of like an interesting time to kind of reflect on the ways in which my heritage has also informed the ways that I think about voting. I was lucky to really grow up in a household full of laughter, joy, and love. Blessed to have 2 parents. They're still together. I also grew up with my grandmother, who this year will turn 96, and is an amazing woman, definitely the matriarch of our family. I'm proud to say that she has 2 bionic knees. She decided at the age of 90 and 92 that she would get knee replacement surgery because nothing was going to stop her from continuing to garden, continuing to sew, continuing to chase her great-grandchild around the house. So that's my grandmother. And I was fortunate enough to go to Catholic schools for most of my life. I was educated by the Sisters of the Good Shepherd, de Celle du Bon Pasteur. So there's a bit of a French-Canadian connection there as well. So I was educated and in a French immersion environment for about 8 years. And I went to high school with the Edmund Rice Christian Brothers. So the ways in which these 2 particular congregations influence the way that I see the world is particularly notable. But I point to one particular instance when I was 10 years old. It was at that time that the biopic on the late Archbishop Oscar Romero was released, and I had a chance to watch that. And at 10 years old, I felt a very visceral kind of gut level reaction to what I had watched and experienced. And I couldn't quite understand why it is that people were treated so badly, and particularly those who were marginalized in El Salvador, at the hands of elite and the powerful, and those with guns and those with a lot of means. And I couldn't quite understand it. And I remember trying to have a conversation with my parents about it over dinner, but still couldn't quite understand how it is that people could do what they did and still continue to do around the world to one another. But I was also captivated by this capacity for transformation because, as I recall, Oscar Romero in the beginning of that film was elected to be kind of a person who wasn't going to rock the boat. He was going to be kind of an even keel archbishop who was going to kowtow to elected officials. But he had a transformative experience through his encounters with the people that he was called to minister to. And I think that's particularly important. And I remember not being able to articulate that, but understanding and seeing it through that particular movie. So it kind of laid the importance of being able to connect with the marginalized. Another poignant experience growing up, as Jenny mentioned, I am also a professional musician by avocation. And one of the most influential musicians in my life was a musician and humanist by the name of Roger Waters, who was the bass player for a rock band called Pink Floyd. And that particular rock band, I was really enthralled by the music, but after I sort of picked up the lyric sheets and started to analyze what it is that Roger Waters was kind of railing about, I was like, wow, this guy has some pretty important things to say about how we ought to treat one another. He was anti-war. He had this real visceral critique of extreme capitalism and fascism. If you recall, on an album called Dark Side of the Moon, he had this song called Us and Them. And really the idea behind the song Us and Them is that there is no us and them. There's just us. And I remember that made a big impact upon me in my teenage years. And I remember also there was one particular song that had a lyric which stays with me today. It's a song called Echoes, and it goes something like, strangers passing in the street, and by chance two separate glances meet, and I am you, and what I see is me. So do I take you by the hand and lead you through the land to help me understand the best that I can? And I'm like, what is this guy talking about? And but it just goes to show that there's this capacity for empathy, that we need to have that capacity for empathy as human beings. I'm going to fast forward a little bit. As Jenny mentioned, I moved down to the United States. Actually, it was when that bio was written, it was 10 years ago. It's now 12 years ago. So I moved down here in August of 2008. As Jenny mentioned, sort of bounced around a few different Catholic schools, holding a few positions in campus ministry, teaching religious studies and teaching music. But I also had a lot of unanswered questions, having been a cradle Catholic and growing up in a Catholic household and attending Mass faithfully every Sunday, as a Filipino Canadian boy would, with a 95-year-old, very pious grandmother. And but I had some unanswered questions, so I thought that the best way for me to answer some of those questions was to undertake graduate studies in theology. So I enrolled at JST and studied theology, and that's where I really got a chance to understand Catholic social teaching. And the Jesuits have this tagline, that one of their aspects of the mission of the school is to not impose, but to inspire people to have a critical faith that does justice. And so I take that to mean, as somebody who is faith-filled, or tries to live faith-filled, that it's important that I just don't take my faith without that real critical lens. I think that God gave us brains, and so we must take and use our intelligence, our God-given intelligence, in order to really discern and kind of think about the issues of the day and the things that are before us. But it was since living here in the United States, definitely the aspects of inequality and systemic racism and marginalization of all types have become really, really apparent. And it's not to say that these things don't happen in Canada, but because I grew up with sort of a particular lens and a particular atmosphere and geography, it sort of colored the way that I looked at the world. In many ways, I couldn't believe that there was such systemic inequity that exists here in the United States, which for all intents and purposes is one of the so-called powerful nations in the world, one of the most richest, wealthiest nations in the world. And how could such inequities happen here? So social justice looks very different here than it does in Canada. And so in 2014, I thought that it was important for me to become more civically engaged. And so I decided to become a dual citizen. And so I retained my Canadian citizenship, but I'm also a US citizen. Just a quick parenthetical note, it's interesting to note the US government actually doesn't recognize dual citizenship for that. So as far as the US government's concerned, I'm nothing but an American, but of course no other country in the world recognizes US sovereignty on their own soil. So when I'm in Canada, I'm Canadian. When I'm in the United States, I'm a United Statesian, I guess you could say. So yes, now I work down the street at Cristo Rey de la Salle High School. I was founding vice principal, and made a switch a little bit earlier this year to work in our mission advancement office. There's a significant amount of need for operations and logistics in that area, and so I answered that particular call to help in that way for our particular school. And so how does that all kind of lead to this idea of having an informed conscience? Just going back to what I had mentioned earlier about the 3 E's, the experiences, encounters, and ecclesia. Through my time of working with young people and students, through the encounters that I've had with movies and musicians, and even in my own upbringing as a Filipino Canadian boy in Canada, all of these have helped to kind of shape the way that I see the world. And in particular, I must credit the Jesuits for helping to instill a sense of that critical faith that does justice, so that I might look at the issues with an informed conscience, a conscience that hopefully is reflective of who I am in my totality. So there we go.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Now I'd like to introduce our third guest tonight. Joyce Scotland is a native of Oakland, California, and she's also a native of a lot of holy names. She was educated by the Sisters of the Holy Names of Jesus and Mary at Sacred Heart Elementary School, as well as Holy Names High School and Holy Names University. She also attended the University of San Francisco Law School. Joyce has served on numerous boards in the Oakland Bay area, including serving on the Holy Names High School Board of Directors, the Sacred Heart Church Parish Council, and is currently a member of St. Columba Church Pastoral Council down here, not too far from where I live in North Oakland. Joyce was recently named to the very newly developed Oakland Diocese Racial Task Force, which is a new thing, and I'm so excited that she's part of that. Joyce is a member of numerous social justice organizations and is an active member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority. She has worked on a variety of campaigns and has worked towards the passing of just and fair ballot measures. She believes that voting is a right and not a privilege. Thanks, and here I will welcome Joyce to share some of her thoughts.
Thank you, Jenny. Thanks so much. Thank you for having me here. It's lovely to be with all of you and to talk about something so important as faith and our voting. I think for me, and I actually wanted to add, Sister Marcia shared about her siblings. I am number 6 of 7 children, all of whom were educated by the Holy Names nuns, either just in elementary school or at the high school as well. So very, very proud of that. And I love the Sisters of the Holy Names. And I want to start by sharing a quote from that we all know. It's not actually a quote, it's a verse of Blessed Mother Marie Rose. I have come to cast fire on the earth. How I wish that fire were blazing already. And I've remembered that since my days at Sacred Heart, and I carry that with me. And interestingly enough, it was in the gospel, I believe last week or the week before. But that's kind of how I look towards everything that I do with the social justice lens. What can I do to get things blazing? How can I bring my faith to, and in my view of my faith, to makes just and fair change where there needs to be change and consistency where there needs to be consistency. I think that I lean a lot towards Pope Francis with his, particularly the encyclicals, the most recent one, Fratelli Tutti, which is really talking about the care of one another. So me as a Catholic preparing to vote, what do I need to look at? How can I care for my brother and sister on this earth? How will these propositions, how will these measures, how will these candidates affect the people, my brothers and sisters on this earth? So that is something that's very important to me. I too have looked to the to network the Sisters on the Bus and Sister Simone Campbell, and they actually recently promoted something, the equally sacred priorities for voters in the 2020 presidential election, and compared and contrasted several of the Catholic social teachings and how the candidates weigh in on those teachings. So that's been really important to me. I read a lot of the National Catholic Reporter and other publications, and use that in my discernment process to decide how I'm going to approach different things. And I think, again, I go back to when I taught, our number one rule in my classroom was always the golden rule. Treat others the way you want to be treated. And so I think if I were a person who were who was affected by a ballot measure or a candidate, how would I want that to impact me? And as an African American woman, Catholic, who has multiple sclerosis, I feel like my interest lies in so many different categories. Having multiple sclerosis myself, but my sister also has multiple sclerosis. So we have one of the top pre-existing conditions with healthcare. How will some of these things affect me and others like me who have MS or some other chronic disease? So I use that lens. I use my lens as an African American for access to education or economic equity. And then as a woman, voice of, how is that affected? So I feel like I take all of these things and use that in my discernment again. And I also look, and we just recently finished the season of creation inspired by Pope Francis's Laudate Si, and the care of the earth and care of creation. What are our actions now? How are our actions affecting this amazing gift that God has given us in this earth? And how are we leaving this gift for the next generation and the generations to come? So that's also been important. So bringing all of these things together and looking at each measure, and as Sister Marcia alluded to, really looking at the measures, because so many of them, they say this thing, but then you look further and actually there's a loophole or something else that's stuck into it that changes the meaning. So then I have to go back to how will it affect the least of us, the least of my brothers and sisters, and what will the outcome be for them? Am I reading this and treating this in a way that I would want to be affected? So I think all of those things kind of coincide, and then prayer. Really, I have to pray and think, okay, if I were sitting down having a conversation with the Pope or with Jesus, if I could be so blessed, could I in good conscience say that I really did the thing that was going to best serve my brothers and sisters on this earth? And am I doing what is going to best serve this earth? So and it's interesting because some of the quotes that Sister Marcia shared were quotes that I had highlighted here, so I won't share them again, but I would encourage everyone to really prayerfully look closely at, particularly some, they call it down ballot, some of these propositions and measures. So the big pieces are very important, but the small pieces are important as well. And I recommend going to network. I recommend reading some of what Pope Francis has written. And I will share a couple quotes that were not previously shared. One from, and forgive my pronunciation, this is not my gift, from Gaudete Exulte. And Pope Francis says, equally sacred are the lives of the poor, those already born. So we have to be mindful in not making as kind of the road that some have gone down to making this a single issue election. It's a multi-issue election. We have to look at, again, the lives that are already born. And another quote from his general audience on June 3rd, 2020. We cannot tolerate or turn a blind eye to racism and exclusion in any form and yet claim to defend the sacredness of every human life. So we just have to be mindful to not be single issue, but multi-issue, and look at the big picture. How are we all being treated? How are our brothers and sisters being treated? And if we had to have that conversation with Pope Francis or with Jesus, would we really be able to say that we did as they have taught us to do? So
Thank
I
you.
think that's it for me.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Joyce. I'm going
Thank
to pass
you.
this to Father Sal.
Well, thank you all. Wonderful insights and wonderful that you're not just sharing principles and theory, but talking about your life and telling your story. And I think that's, I think that's what Jesus does. We tell our stories. From what I heard, I certainly heard common threads. The common thread of proportionality, that there is more than the single issue, and to look at the bigger picture. The other common thread is informed conscience, getting information, reflecting, pausing, asking questions, bringing that all together, which is the discernment process. As I'm thinking of a question, it's how to formulate this question for you. Believing that faith, of course, is a process. Thinking of your younger self, thinking of yourself in grade school, in high school, in college, all those different stages of your faith formation. Looking back at your younger self, what would you say to our college students today? Thinking about your college years, what was important then? What helped you to get to where you are today? I hope that makes sense. Just trying to think about how do you, I think, Chris, you said a lot more about this, about your growth along the way. But like each of you, if you care to respond, invite you to respond, what would you say to a college student today as you think about your younger self and where you were at that time in your faith formation? Any advice, any suggestions, any hopes for them? And whoever wants to speak first would be great.
I could start to that. I grew up, born in San Francisco, but when I was 5, my family moved to Marin County. Although I say at that point, Marin County was the burbs. It wasn't the wealthy enclave it is now. Our little starter house was probably, I don't know, I forget. I asked my mother what it was recently, but was not a lot of the kids I went to school with weren't all that wealthy. But Marin was so very white, except for Marin City, which had been housing for the shipbuilding during World War II, which had a lot of African American, but that was kind of tucked in a corner. The Latino group that's there now weren't there. Anyway, I grew up thinking that if you worked hard, had level of intelligence, of course you were going to come out on, to be really successful in society. The up by your bootstraps thing seemed to be really true. And entering the Sisters of the Holy Names, I was sent to teach in Southern California in a parish that was kind of middle and some lower middle. And back to school night, I remember these parents coming in, some of whom were Latino or Latinx, which we didn't use at that term. And they were so hardworking and so smart, and they hadn't earned a lot of money. And it was like, oh, okay. So I think part of what's important and then in college, things expanded. The Jesuits expanded my mind as a senior in high school. I used to have what they called the Summer School of Catholic Action. And they brought students from all over the western part of the United States for a week in San Francisco. And that's where I first hit the social encyclicals and learned more about the social justice piece, which wasn't stressed as much in my childhood. But I think trying to be open to the changes, and I think one of the things Holy Names University does well is when people can be in person, is expose people to a wide variety of backgrounds and economic backgrounds, ethnicities, and So it's an opportunity to learn. And it's like you just keep trying to broaden your mind. I've lived in a bubble in the Bay Area, kind of a progressive bubble, but I taught 2 years in central Pennsylvania. And then the time at Brigham Young University, got me interacting with people who thought very different politically. And it was interesting to see, what their worldview is and trying to get my worldview clearer. So I think you keep refining it and you keep broadening your views as you get exposed to more people and more places and more things.
I would echo a lot of what Sister Marcia said, that you have to. I was very blessed and very fortunate to have grown up in a very diverse environment, went to diverse schools, had amazing parents, George and Christine, who gave us a global view. We were able to travel and see other parts of the world and see how different people lived, and it often reminded us of our blessings. And I think that was one of the things that helped start to mold me. I received excellent education, and one of the things that I think stuck out for me at Holy Names, then college, now university, was our world history lessons. To be able to not only know what was going on here in America, but really to have that global view of the world. And my recommendation to college students would be get a global view of the world. Step outside of your comfort zone, step outside of your bubble, see how the rest of the world lives, and really take time of discernment to know what matters to you, what's important, what social justice things stick out to you, to really challenge yourself to, again, step outside of your comfort zone, step outside of your bubble, learn as much as you can, travel if you're able, read, really get a global view. And if there's a group or a culture or something that you don't know a lot about, try and find out. If you think that you know something about a group but you're not sure, educate yourself, reach out, learn, meet new people. That would, I think, would be an awesome thing. And I think that's something that I've tried to do in my life, and it definitely has served me very well.
I would echo everything that Joyce and Sister Marcia mentioned as well. And maybe the only thing I would add is that I think it's also important for college students, and all people, for us to have conversations with one another and to engage, particularly with people with whom we may disagree, and not to shy away from those conversations, because it provides us with opportunities to really clarify what we might think about something. But more than anything, it also provides us with an opportunity to engage in some deep listening, which I think is something that maybe we've been missing for the last 4 years, is the opportunity to really hear one another. And I remind my high school students, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. So we listen twice as much, twice more than we speak, right? And so I think it's important to continue to engage in conversation. And certainly that's made a little bit more complicated with social media and online communications. And sometimes those aren't the best avenues or the best forms to be able to have nuanced conversations. When the time comes where we can have face-to-face conversations would be ideal. But even in a setting like this, where we can actually see one another and see one another's faces and read one another's body language and hear one another's tone of voice, all of those things matter when we communicate. And so often, and I've been a victim, not a victim, I should say, I've been somebody who has gotten caught up in some of the online conversations when I probably shouldn't have, over Facebook or over Twitter or Instagram. And really what I should have been doing was maybe just kind of listening, shutting up and listening and trying to understand and to place myself in the position of somebody with whom I disagree, which is very difficult, which is really, really difficult sometimes. and hopefully there's an opportunity for at some point through the course of that for me to be able to share my particular perspective and point of view. And even at the end of it, if we still continue to agree to disagree, hopefully we can acknowledge one another's humanity through the course of that conversation. And then maybe we can kind of just come a little bit closer together. And then so next time we have another conversation and you know, we get to know one another a little bit more deeply and a little bit more closely and come to understand that, you know, this person is not just a collection of ideologies and theories and perspectives, and they're a real human being with real needs and desires and fears, and it's so important for us to be able to understand. There's a friend of mine who actually incidentally lives in Canada, and lest we think that Canada is this big kind of progressive bubble, it's definitely not. But this friend of mine had seen some of the posts that I had put up on Facebook, and he had the urge to want to comment and to share his opinion about this particular thing that I had posted. And through the course of that, we actually started to, he's a high school friend of mine, and I had no idea that he thought this way about this particular issue. But it was through the course of this online conversation, now sustained over 4 years, where he has actually opened my eyes to some of the ideas that had informed his thinking. So, you know, not everything progressive is well thought out, and not everything conservative is necessarily all well thought out either. And perhaps there's something in the midst of, you know, both of those perspectives kind of coming together, where there is that kind of glimmer of a much deeper and nuanced truth. So many things are being communicated in a very simplistic way, and I think maybe it's only through this kind of sustained conversation where we can really kind of engage. And at the end of it, we may still agree to disagree, and that's okay. But hey, at least we're having conversations with one another. We're acknowledging one another's humanity, and hopefully we can, you know, that can be a start. So.
Thank you all. Jenny will now take us to the next part of our conversation this evening.
I just want to give an opportunity to our speakers, if you have any questions or follow-ups with each other, and if you do, great. If not, we can move into questions from our community. And to do that, as a reminder, if you have questions, there's a couple ways to do that. You can send a chat question to everybody, or send a chat question to campus ministry privately, or raise your hand and we will take your questions. So start thinking about that. But first, is there any follow-up or any questions from our three guests? Just we call this a fireside chat, so
Well, I was
chatting. So, but yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering if what Chris and Joyce saw as some of the biggest challenges of this particular election when you look at that ballot.
Well, I'll say the biggest challenge is the divisiveness that exists in our country today, and it's extraordinarily sad that we are so divided and so unwilling to hear one another and to really look at the bigger issues at hand. And there's so many things that I can call to mind, but for me, that has been the biggest challenge, the divisiveness that exists today.
I think a personal one for me is trying to remain level-headed and not overtly emotional. and a big thing that I did, or my wife and I did a couple of years ago, was to cut cable, and that has been a real blessing in many ways, because it means we're not tied to the 24/7 news cycle as much. We can be a little bit more discerning about the news that we do consume. But oh gosh, yeah, I would say it's the same thing. It's just the sense of division that exists, and the inability to have conversations with one another. Yeah.
Yeah, and I could relate to what you said about, you know, I have just one experience in going down the rat hole on Facebook with a person that I went to high school with who lives in the Midwest, and we had recently connected, but her world is so different from mine. And then some of her friends started posting about that she just, this is like Ohio or someplace, just have been down to Texas, and those DACA students all could have gotten citizenship if they just worked hard on it. And I know that's not true. And I should have shut up, but I did have to engage somewhat, which I'm not sure was particularly useful, particularly on that kind of setting. But it was just so difficult to have somebody be so sure of something that I knew was so inaccurate and that affects so many people. But it's yeah, I'm glad that you could keep going on that one. I'm not sure, I think she may have unfriended me by now, but it wasn't her, it was somebody she knew who had worked in a college as like a career counselor or something. So it was kind of shocking to me.
You know, sister, it is very shocking to me thinking of what you're saying. The people who, it seems to me, their inability to think for themselves, and that has been that they don't fact check and know, okay, what I'm saying is absolutely not true. And that has been extremely troubling in having similar, I haven't gotten engaged in similar conversations because I probably haven't been on Facebook in a month because it just was too overwhelming. But that is really troublesome for me as well.
Thank you. Any other questions between the three of you? I think I might go to Evelyn and see, do we have any questions, Evelyn?
Unmute myself.
Hello.
And I just wanted to remind people just, we could just utilize the chat if we want to send questions in either privately to me or to everyone. And you also have the option to also raise your hand if you want to verbalize your question. And you could do so if you click on participants. And I believe there is an option to raise your hand on the bottom right-hand corner if you would like to also verbalize your question. But we do have a question here.
Before we do that, I am going to sign us off for the recording. Just
Okay.
stop us because I said I would do that. Thank you everyone for being here. This is the end of the recording.